Very pleased to be here today. As he said, I've been studying Mithila art since 1980, my first field trip to India. I didn't go there to study it. I didn't know anything about it when I went there. I actually went to study the amazing social organization of the Mithila Brahmins in Bihar and found out about this art after I got there. But since 1980, I've had a number of trips back, and I've been privileged to know many of the early artists and to watch the evolution, amazing actually, evolution of this art over more than 30 years. And I'm pleased to be here to talk about it today. My plan is to divide the talk into two parts. The first part will really set the background of the ceremonial origins of it, the ritual origins of Mithila art. And that will be contextual. That will take us to the villages. I'll show you what it was like to see the art on the wall and to know the people in their villages. And then we'll have a break. And then I'll talk about the paper art and the building of a market for the paper art that really began in about the 1970s. And in that part of the talk, second half, I've pulled some of the images off the website for the Asian Art Museum. So there's a couple dozen, maybe, of your own paintings that I will talk about. Let me be sure I've got my technology in place here. So, and I love this huge screen. I might, from time to time, step down to look back up at it. I don't very often get such a large canvas for this work. Since there's no exhibit going on right now, why don't we just take a piece of the art. This is a classic piece of Mithila art that I bought in 1984 in the village of Jitwarpur from the artist Boa Devi, who's one of the most famous of these women artists. She's made a huge reputation for herself. Berkeley Gallery did a sole exhibit of her art in, I guess it was 1997. It's been a while now, but here's a very typical piece of Mithila art. So in case you are coming at this cold, have never seen anything like it before, it's immediately identifiable. So have a look, and then why don't we just move to another screen here and describe a little bit about the formal elements of this particular piece. I've got a small one up there. Features that we usually see in a work of Mithila art. So, invariably, a decorative frame. You know that this is a picture. You don't even need to frame it. They're always framed. They put a lot of effort into the ornamentation of these frames. There's never a picture that just sort of goes out and off the frame, off the paper. It's always roughly like this. Almost invariably, a piece of paper 22 by 30 inches. Because this is the standard size that the government of India began manufacturing for them in the 1970s when they tried to encourage this art. So they almost always are the same size. It's pretty nice paper. You could cut it up into 6 pieces, and then you get smaller ones, which they occasionally do, but not too often. I've sometimes thought they might sell better if they were smaller. But a standard size. In the old days, they were unsigned. Nobody thought, these early women painters didn't imagine that who they were mattered. Well, it did matter in one sense. They wanted to get paid for the art. So sometimes they would put their name on the back to be sure that the merchants would pay them their 10 or 15 or 30 rupees, as it was selling for in the beginning. But they didn't take authorship and ownership of it in the sense of Western art history. Although lately they have begun to do that. They've picked up the idea, they've been well informed, that the Western art market expects an artist to have a sense of identity and pride in an individualized voice. We're starting to get a little bit of that now. Wasn't a part of the story early on. So even though this is by Boa Devi, I know that because I bought it from her personally. She hasn't signed it. Very bright and very limited palette, invariably, especially in the early days. We got 3 colors here. that neon pink, that black, and a little yellow. That neon pink was in fashion for a few years, and then it disappeared. I haven't seen the neon pink for a while, but a lot of the art that comes from the 1980s has that bright pink, a little too pink for my taste. Horror vacui, we might say. Every inch is covered. No bare spaces. It's like if you've got a bare space, you fill that with vines, leaves, insects, birds, something. Not entirely clear how that style developed, except that I can say that in their lineage goddess shrines, there will be a symbol of the goddess surrounded by handprints done in rice powder covering as a way of protecting the space. And if you have a vacuum, you have an empty space, evil spirits, boots can come in there. I'm guessing nobody's ever said that's why all the space is covered. It's just the way they do it. Face is almost always in profile. That's such a characteristic look, that little pointy nose, a big forehead, one oval eye. You do occasionally see two eyes head out. Usually, if you see it, it's a deity, like Durga, or the bride and groom. A lot of the art is about a bride and a groom. It's for brides and grooms. I'll have a lot more to say about that in a minute. But almost always in profile. Obviously, they're not interested in representation in some Western sense of those marvelous Renaissance paintings. So gorgeous, so perfect, every face, such an individual. No, we have this standard face. The art is not about that kind of representation. And the themes, generally people engaged in some kind of recognizable cultural activity. Here you've got a bride and groom. They're eating their first meal after they've been married. They're in attendance by a woman behind the bride who is the vidkari. She's the woman who walks the bride through all the steps of a wedding ceremony. And they're having their first meal, very intimate moment in a wedding, in the 4 days of a wedding ceremony. So we'll see a lot of cultural activity in the paintings we're going to look at. Or there'll be scenes from the epics or the myths, such as the Ramayana. I'll show you one in a minute. And then there's more mysterious imagery that is, I guess, aquatic. Images drawn from the ponds that litter the humid landscape of Mithila. I'll show you some pictures that have magical work to do on behalf of the bride and groom, ensuring fertility. I think maybe that's all my points. Yes. Okay. So, little geography. Hope you're all clear on your geography of India. So here we are, state of Bihar, which is just, well, next to West Bengal and then Bangladesh, just shares a border with Nepal. The Ganges River goes down through the middle of Bihar. The area we're talking about, Mithila, I think I got, yeah, a little circle here, is sort of the center part north of the Ganges River, slops over a little bit into the foothills of Nepal at that area. This is a classic and ancient cultural area known as Mithila. That's why it has the name of Mithila art. This art was done very widely by certain castes in Mithila for a very long time. Don't know for sure how long, but that's where Mithila is. One more map here. I think you've had a lecture on the Ramayana recently, or there's a show, I guess, that just finished in the fall. So you probably know the story. It begins with Lord Ram from the town of Ayodhya, way over in what's now Uttar Pradesh, and Sita, whose father was King Janak, in the town that's now known as Janakpur. It's actually in Nepal, but that border didn't exist in the Ramayana days. So Rama traveled to Janakpur, where actually the town in the epic was called Mithila. The town was called Mithila. He journeys there, pulls the bow, marries Princess Sita. So Sita was a Mithila girl, and they're very proud of that. and don't forget to mention it frequently. And here is a second style of Mithila art. So just right now we're juxtaposing these two styles. The first one you saw, very bright, dense colors. And this is the line drawing style. Some artists, some villages might emphasize this more than the deep colors of the other, but this is a scene from the Ramayana where King Janak is performing a royal ceremony that involves the king plowing a furrow in a field, and he turns up baby Sita in a pot. Sita came out of a pot. There's her mother, but no, she did not give birth in the usual way. This is Sita found in a furrow, to which at the end of the Ramayana she returns. A sort of angry tantrum, goes down into the earth, and that's the end of Sita. So this is done with ink, two colors of ink, black and a red ink. So it's a very different style, but still you get the distinctive features that we just described, that face and profile, that oval eye, two people in this case a scene from the epics. So two very typical pieces of Mithila art. Okay, now I'll tell you a little bit about my own experience encountering and finding this an interesting topic to study. So in 1980, I went to Mithila to work with the Mithila Brahmins, which is the superior caste in a very, very caste-conscious, conservative, traditional part of India. Usually people shake their heads and say, oh, very, very conservative. And I'm going to have to talk about caste, which in a setting like this sometimes makes people uncomfortable because it is so hierarchical, and people are very caste conscious and exclusive, and the higher you are, the better, and the more you look down on people of lower castes. Mithila art has helped to change some of that. I'll get to that toward the end, but you have to always start from that position. So the main town in this area is not Madhubani. Sometimes this art is called Madhubani art. That's a smaller town a little to the north. But the political center of this area is Darbhanga. Very large, dusty, exhausting town to live in, where I lived for most of a year. And this is the entry to the fort. The whole region of Mithila was dominated by one very powerful and rich zamindar who considered himself a Maharaja. The last one was Kameshwar Singh. And this is the entry to their great palace in Darbhanga. And he was a Brahmin too, a Mithila Brahmin, and he had tremendously ranked, even just the Brahmins, the Mithila Brahmins, but there was the highest rank of these Shrotriyas, they're called, who were the people he married with. So I lived with a family that was all intermarried with the Maharaja of Darbhanga, which meant that I had access to high levels, but not low levels in society. I had to be very careful what I did, who I talked to. Don't take food from anybody. Don't let low caste people shake your hand. Had a lot of sensitivities that I had to learn living with this family. And you might wonder, here I've got just one slide about demographics. So you might wonder, do we really have to know this much background? But actually it's relevant. So the castes of Mithila, there's dozens of them. Shortly after independence, the Indian government wanted to identify castes that had had advantages all along and were well educated and going to university and getting the government jobs, versus those discriminated against lower castes who needed to be helped with affirmative action type legislation. So they created this typology, which is not the Varna system, but it's a very important and very real system, categorization, throughout India actually, but this is the breakdown in India, in Bihar. So the so-called forward caste, 22% of the population, four main castes: Brahmins, Kayastas, Rajputs, and Bhumihars. This was the old ruling class in pre-independent India. Then there were the backward castes, as the government identified them. Those that were not getting good educations, those where literacy rates were extremely low, and lower still, unimaginably low among the women. So groups like Baniyas, Yadavs, Kurmis, Quarries. Should say that in the 1990s, really, the politics of this area turned upside down, and a member of the Yadav caste, one of these so-called upper backward castes, became the governor of Bihar. Some resemblances to our current politics actually there. The Yadavs have been in power mostly ever since, or the Bhumihars actually right now. The current governor is Bhumihar, I think. Then the lower backwards, these were the artisan castes, so we've got oil pressers, potters, gardeners, sort of middle low castes, and then the scheduled castes, what used to be called untouchables or Dalits now, Dusad, Chamar, Musahar, very large groups of Dusad, Chamar, Musahar in this area that I'm working at, and then about 16% Muslim. Okay, so these castes really were little cultures. They had their own cultural traditions. And if you were a member of the dominant Brahmin or Caste caste, those two really shared a culture. They shared the art tradition. This Mithila art tradition comes out of the traditional wall art of these two dominant castes, who were the main landowning, educated elite. They weren't always rich. Sometimes they were. They were often very poor. But they were the dominant, superior caste, and it was their culture that did the wall art. That too has changed in recent times, as we'll see, but this is how it was at the beginning. Okay. A couple more pictures from Darbhanga, a place filled with man-made lakes and palaces that have been abandoned. Here's, they've been turned over to the government because Maharajas are no more. They're now postal training centers and universities for the most part. Very humid, hot place. And this is the I was there shot. This is what I looked like 30 more years ago. Very hot day in a tent doing an interview. This, as part of the sort of very patriarchal system and controlling system of the Mithila Brahmins that I was mostly studying, this man who's looking in that book of genealogies, he's a genealogist to the Maharaja and the superior Shrotriyas, but there's many dozens of genealogists that serve the Brahmins, and the Kayasthas also have their tradition. And what this means is all families have genealogies in these books, carefully recorded, going back 24 generations. And if you want to get married, you want to be sure that the person you're marrying is also in the genealogies. And you want to be sure you don't have a common relative closer than 6 generations ago. And the genealogists have to write a little permission slip for a marriage to go forward. So this was all very regulated and controlled and very patriarchal. These are patrilineages. Only men's names are in these books. Women are there only. Every woman is called Kanya. So you've got Bhoganad and Durganad and so on, and another Nod, and then Kanya, 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 meaning 3 daughters. So women's names aren't there, men's names are there. Okay, well, so most of the time I was spending in Darbhanga studying these people, but I kept hearing the women out in the villages paint on their walls, and it's so beautiful. You should go see them. And I too was thinking, about time I get out into the villages where 90% of people lived, and of course an anthropologist wants to be in the villages. I felt a little guilty being in Darbhanga, where we did not have running water or toilets. It was not that convenient, but there were stores and things, rickshaws. So one day, not too long before I was done here for my first field trip, I had bought a Jeep. We took my Jeep out into the villages, and here's what the villages look like. Very typical scene. Huge banyan out in the outskirts, and then you see the low roofs, mostly thatched roofs and mud walls of a very typical village. This is not a rich area. The people who produce this art are not rich. That's why they're doing the art. They're extremely poor. They need money. So, and the region is dotted with these ponds that are almost 100% man-made. In the old days, kings would have them dug as acts of piety, often associated with a temple. Or during British days, there were frequent droughts and famines, and in order to put people to work, their version of WPA was dig a pond. So they'd get people from a local village, the men, working, digging the ponds, and they could pay them a little bit of money. Women didn't do this. Women stayed in their houses and starved. But the men would go out and dig a little pond. So these ponds are all over. They all look man-made. Just to see what a typical house in the village looks like, this house is pretty run down, in very bad shape, and yet this is from one of the highest-ranking Brahmin families in Mithila. It's in the town of Ujjain, the village of Ujjain, in a region of 36 villages where the highest-ranking Srotriya Brahmins lived. And they were the highest rank, first Shreni, which I won't even explain what that means, but very high rank, and yet very poor. So Brahmins, some of them were quite rich. If they were big landowners, they were rich, but many of them were quite poor, so high rank but poor. And here's another house in a different village, Kakror. This is the, I'm actually sitting there interviewing the genealogist. My husband took this picture. So you see what the houses look like. Very typical for this region, including all the people, most of the people whose paintings you get to know when you look at Mithila art. Okay, I made this little sketch because I want to make a point about where the wall art went. So I should say, when I first arrived in Madhubani, my first trip, I was met by the most astonishing army of vendors, young men with rolled up piles of Mithila art, sort of besieging me in my taxi, my Jeep. And this was my first view of Mithila art, very dog-eared, shoddy work, pretty much. They'd sell it for almost anything. I could have bought them for a couple of rupees. Didn't really want them because they were pretty bad. But it was clear already, we're talking 1980, it was clear there was already a market of some kind at work, but the art was not good, at least what I was seeing there. So I went further out of Madhubani into the villages roundabout where people, I was told, most of the good stuff was happening. And so here's a typical interior of a compound, and I'm emphasizing this because I want you to see where the art went and where it didn't go. So the art that went on the walls was almost universally done for weddings, and weddings are this huge deal. And I've already explained how the Maharaja even controlled the marriages of the highest-ranking people. So the art was for a wedding, and a wedding was something that would last 4 days. And in the old days, the girl might well be 6, 7, 8. And the way it worked was, a girl who's 6, 7, 8 could be married. She's too young to go to her husband's house and begin marital life, and certainly not a sex life yet. So they'd had what they'd call a first marriage and then a second marriage when she came of age. So the first marriage was the biggest one, and it would go on for 4 days. The groom's party would come, the barat, they called it, from whatever village he's from. Groom might come with his father and uncles and maybe 20 or 30 men from the village. They'd have 4 days of ceremony. This would be the groom and bride's first chance to see each other. And then at the end, the first marriage, they would just go back and wait till the girl came of age physically. And then there'd be a second one, and they'd do the whole thing over again. And that time, they would take the bride to the groom's house, traumatic moment for this girl, who's now maybe 12, 13, 14. Legally, she should be 16 these days. Usually these days, she is 16 or more. But very traumatic. She's just met this guy for the first time. They haven't yet slept together. That happens in his village, not at her village. But she's taken there by strangers to live in a strange village the whole rest of her life. So this is a tremendous traumatic turning point in the life of a young girl. So this is a compound that has been painted. Over there you can see one wall's been painted, but the compounds are typically 4 houses arranged in a square like I've shown. The green there, the men's house on the far, it's in the east side. This is the public-facing house. This is where the men of the household sleep. It's where visitors from the village or from outside could come and sit on the veranda. You never get inside. If you're a woman, maybe they'll take you inside. Usually a strange man would never get inside here. In the middle is a little, call it the mandap, a little, you can see here, a little covered space, which is where ceremonials take place. And also it's nice out of the rain. But the center part of the compound, that's where life is lived. That's where the women live in purdah. They do observe purdah here. These women don't go out without their heads covered. If they go in a rickshaw, the whole rickshaw is surrounded by a sari. But they live in here, pretty much unveiled. Straight across from the men's house is a special house called the Lineage Goddess Shrine. There's a little mini shrine there for the goddess of their family, and that goddess has been the goddess of all the ancestors going all the way back. So that's where the women worship the goddess of their husband's lineage. And down below you see what the shrine looks like, a pot of dirt. And that dirt has been collected from 7 rivers across India, holy rivers, and the goddess lives in the dirt in that pot. And there's a screen, a veil on the wall. The goddess is in purdah too. The veil covers a sign of the goddess. And what's behind it is not a picture of Durga or the lineage goddess, just a little symbol, little 3, looks like a lotus blossom, very diagrammatic. You never see it, because it's always covered, because she too is in purdah. So that's the western house. Then in the south of the compound is, let's call it the nuptial house. They call it the Cobragar, the marriage house. That's the house where the bride and groom would sleep, and where they meet for the first time, and where the barat, the visiting men, sleep and stay for the duration of the marriage ceremonies. So it's like there's a whole building, small building, just dedicated to weddings. Now, if there's not a wedding going on, which usually there isn't, you can store your rice there, you can sleep there, you can do anything there, but its main identity is nuptial house. And then there's a 4th one in the north. I never could discover whether anything special happens there, but nice symmetry of these compounds. So the art goes in 2 places. It goes in the Cobragar, the southern house, and in the Kuldevi shrine on the eastern side. That's where the art went when they painted up for a wedding. Although, we'll see, when Chitwarpur became a famous star village, they painted everything. The lanes, the steps down to the pond, because film crews would come in and photograph Chitwarpur. But it's not where the art originally went. Here's a scene actually from Chitwarpur, the famous village that I'll take you to in a few minutes. Typical pond, cow, is a prosperous family. They have their own cow. And they've got their own haystack for their cow to eat from. So you see a cow like this tethered, and you know, it's a very well-to-do family, but you see they've still just got a mud house. And the painting is on the outside of this house, but this is Chitwarpur, and a film crew had recently been there. So they got all the people from the village together to paint everything up because that's what the film crew wanted to see. Have to watch out for this stuff. Anyway, so I began photographing these beautiful paintings that had been painted on the wall for a wedding some years past, maybe this year. They gradually decay, fade away. I sometimes think of this picture as the fading of the women's world. But I think that's beautiful, and here's one on the other side of the doorway. So you can see it's those same faces in profile, unself-consciously made. It was for a real wedding. It wasn't for the film crew. And here's a marvelous Durga on a lion. And this is the woman, the older woman of the house who's painted it for her daughter's wedding. She's a widow, you can tell from her white sari. And this, that little girl's crying because of me. I had these big, this was 1980, had these great big glasses, 1980s glasses. Terrified this little girl. But that's the scene of Sita giving a garland to Lord Ram, scene from the Ramayana. And this is a beautiful interior at the house in Jitwarpur of one of the most famous of the artists, Sita Devi. But you see, there's Krishna and Radha and an Ardhanarishwar, half Shiva, half Shakti, in the middle with snakes around him. And over here, Sita giving a garland to Ram. And the family, kids, and the luggage piled in front. Yeah, very typical but beautiful scene, really. We're doing on time. Okay, we're good. Okay, so I was interested in how far back this art goes, because some of the propaganda you'll hear put out by people who are pushing Mithila arts at 5,000 years. Been going on 5,000 years. I seriously doubt that. There's multiple texts of the Ramayana. The earliest is by Valmiki, and it does talk about Janakpur. Nothing about painted villages, but the 16th century text by Tulsidas does mention painted villages in Mithila. So maybe by then they were already doing it, but what does it look like? We have no idea. The stuff, these huts don't last. You don't find them archaeologically surviving. But I did know, and I got very curious about the discovery of this marvelous art. And it all began with the Western world knowing about it, which is what has led to the art market. The Western world discovered it in 1934. Bihar had a terrible, terrible earthquake. Its epicenter was just south of, what's that big mountain in Nepal, the biggest? Everest. Everest, yeah, sorry. It's not a difficult fact to remember. Just south of Everest. But it demolished houses all over Nepal and North India. And and this part of Bihar was worst hit. So 10,000 people died. The earth shook for 5 minutes. That's really what did it. It just kept shaking. And these houses are built with brick and no reinforcing. They just crumbled to the ground. If you lived in a 2-story house, which was about as big as they got then, you were probably killed. The villagers who lived in their adobe houses were better off. They probably got out alive. For once, things favored them. But it was extremely destructive. I think I might have another. Yeah, here's another one. So this was a temple, had been a temple. So there was a district officer by the name of William G. Archer, whose job it was to survey the damage. He was sort of the FEMA expert of his period in Bihar. He hadn't been posted there for very long. His job was to survey the damage and see what they could do to mitigate and rescue people and put Bihar back on its feet. So he goes throughout all these villages where the houses have been broken apart and people's lives destroyed, and he's stunned by the beautiful paintings he sees in these houses. had never seen anything like it. And he couldn't do anything about it then, and anyway, those houses were destroyed. But he resolved when he had a chance he would come back and do a serious photographic study, which he did do in 1940. Okay, hang on. He did do that in 1940. And I knew about this. And I thought, wow, I wonder what happened to all that, all those photographs. So in the summer of 2000, I told my husband, hey, I got a project. Let's go live in London for 2 months. And we'll work at the British Library and see Archer's photographs. So that was great fun. We go back to London every chance we get. So the British Library has 150 million items. They get 3 million new items every year. The India office records are all kept there, so that's where a South Asianist wants to go. If you can, I'm an anthropologist. I'm not really trained for archival work, so it sort of tore my hair over this, but tried to figure out how it worked. And here's what I found. William Archer, and above all his wife, Mildred Archer, who outlived him by a couple decades, were very meticulous in their photography. Way better than I've been, I'm ashamed to say. They kept records of every village they went to, every household. Here's file slips. They made these contact sheets of all their photos, and these little 1-inch, those are actually very small pieces of paper. Everyone was labeled, and the caste, the subcaste, the village name, the name of household, what the event was, what the subject matter was. There's about 200 of these file slips, and more than that, hundreds of photos, black and white. But it was so meticulously recorded, I thought, oh gosh, this is interesting. So, but you can't just, I would have liked to take all this data away with me or photograph everything. They would let you photograph 1/3 of every file, big file folder, so I got all the data I could. And what I was later able to do was to reproduce the route that he took in 1940 through these villages, which interested me because I'd already been living in this part of India. So I'm just going to show you where he went. So I'm down here. Oh, I got a little thingy. How does this work? Oh, okay. So down here, Darbhanga, this is the main town where I'm staying. Over here is a little region of about 36 of the highest ranking Srotriya Brahmin villages. Up here is a region of second-level Mithila Brahmin villages, and the town of Madhubani. So Madhubani art is the alternative name for this art, okay? So here's where he went. And my husband and I've been telling him, Don, I think we should go back and reproduce this trip. I think it'll make a great story. So maybe we're going to do that someday. So first day, he leaves Darbhanga and goes out to a couple towns, Sakri and Pandol, just outside this Brahmin area. For all the letters that he wrote arranging this trip with Brahmins and Castes, by the way, you can tell the names. Brahmin's surname is usually Jha, J-H-A, sometimes Singh, if they're related to the Maharaja, but Jha. And the Caste names are usually Das, the surnames. So these are all Jhas and Dasas whose households he went to. And they were Indian officials that he would have naturally written to. And they sort of arranged his trip, obviously. It's how you have it done, or had it done then. So day 1, he goes there. Day 2, he goes and visits villages all along here, ends up in Kakror, which was interesting to me because my genealogist, to whom I apprenticed myself, was from that village. And his father had been the guide to Archer when he went through Kakror village. So that was an interesting connection. And day 3, he sort of goes back and does some more villages. You'll notice Jitwarpur isn't on this list yet. And these people would not have taken him to Jitwarpur because the Jitwarpur Brahmins were Mahapatras, meaning they managed the death ceremonies. Bad news and inauspicious. They were Mithila Brahmins, but they were sort of avoided by these elites. And then the fourth day, he went to some villages in Sotipur, including Ujjain. I showed you a picture of a house from Ujjain. So that's where he went. He visited maybe, I forget exactly how many, maybe 40 households. And let me show you some of the photos he took. Oh, he missed one. See red up there, Rajnagar? That was where Maharaja Maheshwar Singh had been building a whole new palace complex. He was planning on moving the palace from Darbhanga to Rajnagar. In 1918, 1920, he's building this. 1934, the earthquake hits, everything shakes to pieces. He abandons the project, and that palace and its ruins have been locked ever since. But I got in. I'll show you in a minute. In the meantime, here's some of his photos, unfortunately black and white, and clearly painted after these households had been rebuilt after the earthquake. They're still surviving in 1940. So this was a Caste household. And here's a Hanuman. You can see the wavy walls here. And here's Durga, probably, and Ganesh, probably glorious colors, could we but see them in color. And who is that? Must be Durga over there too. And here's typical women with an elephant hati on her head. Notice those eyes. Don't see that very often. 1940, two eyes, two round eyes staring out. Oh, in our conversation earlier, where'd he go? About the blank eyes. Maybe they didn't do pupils in animal eyes. I don't really have a thought about that, but okay. So, lots of those pictures locked up in the British Library. You hardly can see them. I'd love to have a set of the whole thing, but maybe I'll try to get them to do that. Anyway, the Rajnagar Palace. So here's a couple shots of the Rajnagar Palace. The Maharaja's family was not in town. They were in Calcutta when the earthquake hit, so none of them died. But here's the ruins, some of the ruins still standing there in the sun, the winter sun. So 3 different times I tried to get into this palace. In all cases, the guy with the key was out of station, which is what you often hear in India. I didn't finally get in until 1996 when we made a trip there. So finally, we're standing outside. The Maharaja, when he built this, so this is up at Rajnagar, not in Darbhanga. He built the same kind of traditional compound as poor village Brahmins would build, with the 4 houses in a square. But look at how substantial these are. These are good quality houses. They're not in such great repair right now, but finally got inside, and I couldn't believe my eyes, what I was seeing. This is the Cobragar, the marriage house. It was painted for the wedding in 1919 of the only princess, Darbhanga princess, married in the 20th century. And the Maharaja was Maheshwar Singh, and he was not on such great terms with the Brahmins because he had gone to Britain, crossed the Kalapani, crossed the Forbidden Ocean, and they were pissed. And so he was trying to do everything right. He was actually a very conservative Brahmin. So he did everything right, including marrying his daughter to the highest ranking Brahmin, a young man who was first Shreni, not telling you about the Shreni system, but he was first Shreni. He was poor as a church mouse, but he was highest ranking Brahmin. No problem. He could make him rich. He couldn't educate him. He also wasn't very educated. But he had done what the Brahmins wanted to see. He had observed their most conservative marriage, in this vast politics of marriage. So this was decorated for that marriage. But look at how beautiful the wall art is. And I was just down to my last half roll of slide film, wouldn't you know it, but I did get these shots. So decorations all around this door and the Cobra Gar, and you can see how it's decaying up the wall from mold. And this is one of the corners. Look at the panels, and look at the dirt. I got a better one of that. Here we go. So here too, they had divided it into about 3 tiers, and they'd created a border for each image, and then one picture in each square. There's Saraswati, eyes forward. She's a goddess playing her lute. Oops, here. And here's the aquatic symbolism. All of the fertility of a Mithila pond is thought to bring fertility by a kind of metaphorical extension to the bride and groom. There's Krishna up above, and this beautiful Durga over a fireplace. She's the warrior goddess. We need some warrior goddesses these days, don't we? I was sort of hoping Hillary was it, but she did not defeat my Sasur. So here's a bride and a groom in pretty bad shape, and these women, sort of magical figures around the back, along the back. So this was such continuity with the art I was seeing on the walls in 1980. It was very satisfying to me for the sort of cultural history continuity here. And an important background and support for the knowledge that I was pretty sure of all along, that it was really this 2 group of Brahmins, I mean the Brahmins and the Castes, who had traditionally been the purveyors and makers of this art. Now it has, as we'll see, it has expanded and everybody's doing it, which is a good and wonderful thing. It has had a tremendous effect on mitigating some of the worst of the caste features in recent decades, but this is where it was then. Okay, we could go a little bit more before we take a break. Is that okay? Another 5 minutes. So I've really been here talking about, or I am talking about, 2 cultural projects, 2 kinds of cultural projects. William Archer was engaged in the production of knowledge, which is what the British Empire did wherever they went. They had district officers who were half anthropologists, or they had actual anthropologists who studied the cultures of the people, the better to govern them, for sure. But this knowledge has proved to be important. It gives historical depth to things going on now that we watch going on now. The world is changing fast. These women's lives are changing. But we value, certainly, even though we can acknowledge the dominance, the imperial dominance of that project. But secondly, since independence, 1947, independent India was very concerned with raising the standard of living of people all over India, and a lot of effort went into the marketing of culture, trying to find ways for folk traditions all over India to be turned to some kind of profit to lift people out of poverty. And I think you've seen how impoverished this area was. And it has done it's been a huge success, above all in Mithila. So by 1970s, Mithila art has been brought up. Well, Indira Gandhi strongly supported this. A friend of hers, Pupul Jayakar, a woman artist, was sort of given the task of going out to Bihar. I've read the letters between Pupul and Archer in the British Library. Pupul is asking Archer, now where did you go? What villages? And he's writing back, oh, you got to contact so-and-so and go to these villages. And by the way, I did discover the art, right? He was very concerned with getting credit for being the discovery of this art. I stand here giving him credit. He'd be happy. So, but what they did then was to establish some development boards, provide paints and papers, and encourage the first little bit of women experimenting with putting this stuff on paper, which meant instead of having a whole wall space, you had 22 by 30 inches. And how are you going to fill that space? And what's it going to look like? It's going to be different. So the early experiments, back to this point, were about their marriages, because this is what the art had been for, mostly. Not often for anything else. Not for funerals. Maybe occasionally for a janu, a sacred thread ceremony, but not much of that either. Really marriages. So here's a village marriage going on. Bride's dad has his back to us. The bride and groom are facing us. You can see the bride with her head down on her knee. That's how a bride experiences her wedding, with her head down or her face totally covered. She's not yet met this man she's marrying. I sort of followed them from the time the marriage was arranged till the groom arrives and throughout the ceremony. And over here on the right, the young man looking at a manuscript, it's his first wedding. So he's working, and of course the groom and the bride's father, they're Brahmins too. So they'd have to stop every now and then and correct him. It was a very interesting wedding to watch, but anyway. So the wedding is going on, and when they first started, forgot this part. The point was to call the gods to witness the marriage. So you want Durga there. You want the sun and the moon and the stars there. Here's a bride in back behind. See the sun, see the moon, see the nakshatra, the 9 stars, the 9 planets. You want the fertility of, this is my favorite actually, because it just shows all the marriage art. The pond. All that fertility comes out of a pond. If you ever sit by a pond, like a lotus pond, which I used to have one in my backyard, and I'd sit there, when a new lotus is about to come up, it sort of comes up as a kind of a phallic vine poking out of the water, and then it opens into a beautiful lotus blossom, and the leaves come up in the same way and then lay out across the surface of the water, and then insects buzz, dragonflies and mosquitoes and snakes in the water. Don't like to think about that part. But that aquatic life, they painted that a lot in the beginning, and I said, what is this about? Parane, lotus leaf. So, well, just as a seed drops into a pond and many lotus appear, so the bride and groom should have many offspring. So I think the metaphor is pretty clear. And that's a sort of a magical connection that they believed was happening, and that fertility of the pond hopefully being brought to the bride and groom. So that's why you always see, and aside the bamboo, see the green shoots of bamboo over there? The same word for bamboo and lineage, bans. So a lineage is like a clump of bamboo, all coming out, all the sons coming out of a common root. So all of this important, powerful symbolism of the wall art. And here's a pond where I sat in Darbhanga for most of a year. You can see the bamboo and the flowers and everything. Okay, I'll stop after this. We'll take a break. So they painted their own experience at the beginning, especially. So here's the part called Saptapadi, the 7 steps around the sacred fire. That's wall art, the bride following the groom in those steps around the sacred fire. There's a ceremony where the bride worships Gauri, the goddess she's been praying to ever since she was a little girl, a prayer that says, Gauri, how's it go? Gauri, you take these gifts and just give me your suhag, your blessing of having a good husband. Gauri was married to Shiva. She prays for a good husband like Shiva, who is sitting behind her. And then she painted that scene, the elephant, Gauri, her husband sitting behind her, the Vidhakari behind them, and Gauri herself is little beetle nut in the thing on top of the head of the elephant. And there's the elephant, a little beetle nut there, and there's a detail from that painting. So they're painting their own experience. And here's a ceremony where the men of the groom's family, the men of the bride's family, pound rice together. Little sexual metaphor there. Mixing the rice of two patrilineages, mixing the seed of two patrilineages in the bride, the container, get it? And there's a painting of that same thing happening. And then finally, the bride run to her husband's village in the carriage. This painting there shows you the bride and groom inside. This is a special caste, the Kahar, who do this running. Okay, well, maybe a good place to stop.